So some updates. The first one is from my Halloween / sew-in / Dia de los Muertos video. So one of my friends and my day on campus. In my undergrad, you can have a day on campus or you can have an overnight campus stay, and it's essentially where you just shadow a student that's within the major or the program that you want to be going into. You can also just experience campus life, which it actually was a good precursor into campus life. I've heard some odd stories of people taking their DOCs to a party though, which I feel like is really dumb, but you know, whatever. And so she shared some tips with me because she does actually celebrate Dia de los Muertos. She said there are certain parts of the ofrenda that have certain meanings depending on your family and how you were taught about parts of the ofrenda. There's something called copal that can be used in ofrendas to ward off evil or to purify the altar or the grave. I, of course, will always welcome those kinds of feedbacks or extra information or critiques of any form, especially when it's about cultures that I'm not a part of. So thank you, Alex. Next is defunding the police. So I had made this affirmative action script pretty much after defunding the police, but the current events kind of meshed all of the plans, like just kind of changed everything. So essentially I wasn't able to do this kind of follow-up after the defunding the police video. This is a link and it's called Camden Arts for Change, and they're in Camden or Camden County, New Jersey, which is where we talked about is like the county or town or municipality that was actually able to defund the police, which it wasn't really a full defunding, honestly. They actually have a list of demands that they want from the police, so I'll link it down below. The link was still good when I checked. It's like a Google Drive, like it's like a Google Doc. So today we're going to be talking about affirmative action. If you're a person of color, you probably have gotten this response. Fun fact, I actually got this response from a white woman, kind of white woman, half white. And it's really funny because I feel like people forget that white women also benefit from affirmative action. Affirmative action is defined as steps taken to increase the representation of marginalized communities in areas of employment and education, which historically they have been excluded from. Affirmative action was originally just for race, but has since expanded to protect women, those who are queer and or trans, folks who have disabilities, and veterans, which I actually find really surprising, but it does make sense. The idea of affirmative action was thought about as early as the Reconstruction era in the US, which is after the US Civil War. When that conflict ended, the former slave population throughout the South owned virtually nothing and had only a limited set of skills with which they could make a living. To help these newly emancipated citizens be able to have something, General William T. Sherman proposed to divide up the land and goods from the sizable plantations of southeastern Georgia that were under his command and to grant each black family 40 acres and a mule. This idea came back during the Civil Rights era, and court decisions along with political initiatives to become more equal in the US emerged, along with the adding of the 14th Amendment, which I'm going to probably put a break in and define. Affirmative action developed for 4 decades following the decision in Brown v. Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court held that public school segregation of children by race denied minority children of equal educational opportunities, therefore rejecting the doctrine of separate but equal in public education. On the policy side, finally, former U.S. President John F. Kennedy used the phrase affirmative action in 1961. In an executive order, President Kennedy required federal contractors to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. I feel like my head is like a floating head. We're just gonna put you down a little bit, girl. It was not until 1967 that President Johnson addressed gender discrimination. He issued another executive order on October 13, 1967. It expanded his previous order to include women. If 2 men were running a race, but one had his legs bound together in shackles, they could not achieve a fair result by simply removing the shackles. Instead, the man who had been in chains should be allowed to make up the missing yards from the time he was bound. That's actually equity. That is not equality. Equity is essentially stopping the race and allowing the man to catch up to his competitor. Equality is just taking off the shackles. That's a big thing. Affirmative action just was able to help with equality did not help with equity, because there are so many things still in the background that make it still just as difficult for marginalized communities to fully benefit, for lack of a better word, from affirmative action. As affirmative action grew, it drew criticism, often from men and white people who opposed what they viewed as reverse discrimination. As more women began to work in jobs that had not been traditional jobs, there was an outcry that giving a job to a woman over a qualified male candidate would be taking the job from the man. The men needed a job, was the argument, but the women did not need to work. In her 1979 essay, The Importance of Work, Gloria Steinem rejected the notion that women should not work if they do not have to. She pointed out the double standard that employers never ask men with children at home if they need the job for which they are applying. She also argued that many women do in fact need their jobs, and she criticized the false argument that independence for women is a luxury. The argument is kind of a capitalist argument, but I do understand when you're trying to achieve levels of equality or equity, you're going to try to do it in a way that still kind of upholds a structure that is pretty much the main point for why things are the way that they are in society. It's a weird thing to have to say, that we all need to work. Nobody really should have the heavy need to work, but I do get it. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law. This bill banned employment discrimination by companies that had over 15 employees, regardless of whether or not they had government contracts. This also established the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, or the EEOC, which enforces federal laws that make it illegal to discriminate against a job applicant or an employee because of their race, color, religion, and sex. And that includes pregnancy, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Outside of those, national origin, age, which is 40 or older, disability, or genetic information. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson released Executive Order 11,246, which required all government contractors and subcontractors, people who have a contract with the government, who are also getting paid by the government. I'm guessing subcontractors are probably people who are under those contractors, with 51 or more employees and contracts of $50,000 or more, to implement affirmative action plans to expand job opportunities for people of color. This established the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, or the OFCCP, an agency of the U.S. Labor Department. The OFCCP has said in response to folks who don't agree with affirmative action that affirmative action is not preferential treatment, nor does it mean that unqualified persons should be hired or promoted over other people. What affirmative action does mean is that positive steps must be taken to provide equal employment opportunity. Go off. Affirmative action is not a preferential program. It is not, oh, I'm so lucky that I had some drop of black in my DNA kind of program. It is something that is there because your systems and institutions are bigoted. So now we're going to get into some critiques against affirmative action. First critique: when the employers and the schools favor women and blacks, which if they ever say blacks, exit out the conversation, just pack it up. They commit the same injustice perpetrated by Jim Crow discrimination. This reverse discrimination violates the public equality which defines citizenship. So to dispute what was just said, according to the Commerce Department, there are fewer than 2 million unemployed black civilians and more than 100 million employed white civilians. That was taken from the U.S. Bureau of the Census in 1994. I'm sure it is vastly different now. This means that even if every unemployed black worker were to displace or take the job from a white worker, it would be less than 2% of white people that would be affected. And while job discrimination is grounded in exclusion, affirmative action is an effort to overcome that exclusion through inclusion. Affirmative action also only applies to job qualified applicants, so the actual percentage of affected whites would be a fraction of 1%. Also, the main sources of job loss among white workers have to do with factory relocations and labor contracting outside of the United States, which is a nice word for outsourcing jobs. Essentially, a lot of companies will put their jobs in countries that have really bad labor laws, so maybe kids can be working in those factories, or they get paid like 15 cents or 10 cents a day or something crazy. So that is one of the biggest reasons for white workers not being able to have jobs or like being displaced from a job. Computerization and automation, so technology just being able to replace them and the job that they do, and corporate downsizing. So maybe a company has to make their company smaller because they might not have enough money. So outside of the corporate downsizing, because you never fully know, but also probably could be one of the reasons, it's more of greed and capitalism that displace white workers, not really black and brown people. I don't know why they keep saying that. They're stealing our jobs. No, honey, your CEOs are stealing your jobs, not me. All right. Another critique is that affirmative action claims that such policies can hinder the prosperity of the groups they were meant to help. And again, that is wrong. Women continue to earn 70 cents for every male dollar, and if you break that down to the nationalities of women, it's even more. Black people continue to have twice the unemployment rate of white people, half the median family income, and half the proportion of who attend 4 years or more of college. And without affirmative action, the percentage of black students on many campuses would drop below 2%. This would effectively choke off black access to higher education and severely restrict progress towards racial equality. There is also probably what the critique was trying to allude or hint towards, which is mismatch theory. That is the idea that using affirmative action to place students in spaces they wouldn't normally be accepted to is actually hurting them because they fall behind and struggle in their studies or job placements. And while this is a valid theory, because it does happen, it's not used as an argument to make sure that people are questioning the systems that exist within their institutions, but it's being used more to exclude people. Mismatch theory does exist for certain people, but it is also really, really rare for it to exist. So no, affirmative action isn't putting me in places where I would not fit. And secondly, 9 times out of 10, it's probably not the person themselves, it's just the way that the system is. We're just gonna go through all of the Supreme Court's interactions with affirmative action, and there's been a lot, and there still is more. There's a court case coming up, I think either this year, probably next year, that still is talking about affirmative action. While the Brown decision declared segregated schools unlawful, it did not create affirmative action to fix discriminatory practices. So they didn't create affirmative action, they did open the door to it. In Green v. County Board in 1968, it declared that positive actions must be taken to integrate schools. The first major legal setback for voluntary affirmative action was University of California v. Bach, which was in 1958. In this case, the Supreme Court struck down an admission plan at the University of California Davis Medical School, or UC Davis Medical School. The plan had set aside 16 places for minority applicants and was challenged by white applicant Alan Bakke, who had been refused admission even though he had higher test scores than some of the minority applicants. The court held that by setting aside a specific number or quota of places by race, the school had violated Bakke's civil rights. And this is something that is pretty much the standard in a lot of the affirmative action cases. I think outside of like job placements. The court found in United Steelworkers v. Weber, which was done in 1979, that the voluntary plan of Kaiser Aluminum Company to promote some of its black workers into a special training program ahead of more senior white workers did not violate the white workers' civil rights when it did not involve quotas.
There were people in my class with lower grades who weren't in all the activities I was in, who were being accepted into UT,
which is the University of Texas.
And the only other difference between us was the color of our skin. I was taught from the time I was a little girl that any kind of discrimination was wrong. And for an institution of higher learning to act this way makes no sense to me. What kind of example does it set for others?
The claim that race cost Fisher her spot at the University of Texas isn't really true. In 2008, the year Fisher sent in her application, getting into the Texas University system was tough. Students entering through the university's top 10 program, which granted the automatic admission to any teen who graduated in the top 10% of his or her high school class, claimed 92% of the in-state spots. Fisher failed to graduate in the top 10% of her class, meaning she had to compete for the limited number of spaces up for grabs. She and other applicants who did not make the cut were evaluated evaluated based on 2 scores. One gave points for grades and test scores, and the other, called a Personal Achievement Index, awarded points for 2 required essays: leadership, activities, service, and special circumstances. And so these special circumstances included your socioeconomic status, and that included the student themselves and the school that they went to, coming from a home with a single parent or one where English wasn't spoken, so English wasn't the first language, and then race. So those were all the special circumstances. Even among those students, her grade point average and her SAT scores were good, but not great. The school's rejection rate that year for the remaining 841 spots was higher than the turn-down rate for students trying to get into Harvard. So, sis could have gotten into Harvard instead of UT. As a result, university officials claim in court filings that even if Fisher received points for her race and every other personal achievement factor, the letter she received in the mail still would have said no. The university did offer conditional admission to some of the students with lower test scores and grades than Fisher. 5 of those students were Black or Latinx, 42 were white. That, of course, wasn't mentioned by Abigail Fisher's lawyers, which will come into play in the next case that we talk about, because dude is in a lot of race cases that make it to the Supreme Court. Neither Fisher nor Blum, Edward Blum, who is Abigail Fisher's lawyer, mentioned those 42 applicants in interviews, nor did they mention that 168 Black and Latinx students with grades as good or better than Fisher's, who were also denied entry into the university. They also conveniently left out the fact that Abigail Fisher turned down an offer from the University of Texas's standard acceptance offer, of which she could have gone to the university her sophomore year if she earned a 3.2 GPA at another Texas university school in her freshman year. The ending decision supported the Fifth Circuit's opinion. There's a lot of courts that you have to go through before it makes it to the Supreme Court. Like, you really have to have a gripe if you really want a case to go to the Supreme Court. So the ending decision supported the Fifth Circuit's opinion, ruling that the race-conscious admissions program in use at the time is lawful under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Justices Anthony Kennedy, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, and Sonia Sotomayor delivering the opinion of the court, and Justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and John Roberts dissenting or giving a disagreeing opinion. The people who affirmed it don't surprise me. The people who did not affirm it don't surprise me either. The court's affirmance of the university's admissions policy today does not necessarily mean the university may rely on that same policy without refinement. It is the university's ongoing obligation to engage in constant deliberation and continued reflection regarding its admissions policies. Essentially, it's the same thing that they keep repeating in all of the other Supreme Court cases. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she also said that the Top 10 program, essentially her opinion was that it was really dumb and shouldn't exist because it locks out a lot of people from being able to be admitted into the schools. Next is Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard University. This one was hilarious as well because I didn't fully understand it. Like, I thought there might have been some like fairness on the plaintiff or the people who sued the university essentially. I thought there might have been a little bit of a point, but now reading the point, I was like, okay, honey, really? Seriously? But anyway. Students for Fair Admissions includes more than a dozen Asian American students who applied to Harvard University and were rejected. They say in their lawsuit that Harvard systematically discriminates against Asian American applicants in violation of federal civil rights law by punishing their high achievement as a group while giving preferences to other racial and ethnic minorities. Just because Asians have the stereotype of being smart doesn't mean that all of them are, and it doesn't mean that other people of color who are not Asian aren't. That's it's such an egotistical thing. When I read that, I was like, seriously? Harvard says its admission system is finely calibrated to produce a spectrum of diversity, not only of race, but of income, ideas, geographic origin, and talents. Diversity means diversity of race. I know people want to say income, people want to say where you're from, people if you're from a rural place or urban place. I know people want to say all of these other things. They say that because they know that their admissions process is so white still that they need to have a different name, a different way of describing diversity. So stop saying that, because it's such a gentrified definition, and I remember that being said to me and being like, I feel like you're wrong and I feel like you know you're wrong, because the next year they didn't say that. If you have to change the definition of diversity, let it go, honey. I'm gonna continue back onto this, into the 3-week trial exposed a lot of admissions secrets about Harvard. There was a dean's or director's list that included the children of wealthy donors who received special consideration in admissions, and a lap list, a list of students who admissions officers felt could be cut at the last minute to balance the composition of the class the way they wanted to. I think I've heard a lot about how Harvard's admissions processes are just like not always the greatest or the fairest, so this isn't surprising to me. When presenting the case, the plaintiffs argued that because the share of academically qualified Asian American applicants was so high, Harvard resorted to using a personal rating, which brought in stereotypes about Asian Americans being quiet and studious to cut down the number they admitted. Harvard responded that descriptions like quiet and studious had been used for students who were not Asian American as well, and that admissions officers looked not just at the larger group, but at more disadvantaged subsets of Asian Americans, like Cambodians or Vietnamese folks. So in the most recent court case decision on this case, Federal District Court Judge Allison Burroughs ruled that Harvard's race-conscious admissions process is fair and that it doesn't discriminate against Asian American applicants, at least for now. Again, ensuring diversity at Harvard relies in part on race-conscious admissions. And this case might get in front of the Supreme Court in the near future, but it hasn't yet. They do not like talking about race.